For my project, I chose the legalization of prostitution. Um, so regardless of its consistent camouflage through stigma or embarrassment, prostitution has remained deeply embedded in American history and culture. And it's a really controversial issue today because on one side, many people perceive prostitution as a federal offense and overall degrading, and in their eyes, legalizing the industry would be like publicly promoting an unhealthy or abusive system. Whereas, as you can see in the top photo, kind of how it talks about how in the infographic above, prostitution, it says that prostitution is the second fastest criminal industry. And the infographic also further shows how like prominent and widespread the system is on a global basis. It's not just like national or anything. And then on the other side of the controversy, as time progresses, societal values have continued to shift towards less regulatory restrictions regarding like people's bodies, and many people believe that we should continue this and continue to become gradually more accepting of everyone as a whole community, especially when it comes to enabling people's sexual freedom. Um, and for my anecdotes, I chose two women who were previously prostitutes, and one woman is Jacqueline. Oh, and for the sake of like safety reasons, they don't have any photos of them or last names. And Jacqueline was 39 years old and was a part of the industry for about 12 years. And one quote from her interview that really stood out to me was that prostitution is less about sex than people expect. And one part of Jacqueline's, and so this really stood out to me because what people often overlook with prostitution is that they think it's just for sex, when a lot of times it's these prostitutes are like giving people other forms of like connection that people typically feel like deprived from in like their normal modern life. And so Jacqueline, for example, talked about how she was able to create supportive and beneficial relationships with the people that she worked with, and sometimes it was just talking or like alternate forms of communication. And in return, not only did she feel safe and in control, but she was also financially stable, and she felt kind of satisfied in knowing that she was making a difference in other people's lives as well. And then another anecdote is Ruse, and Ruse is 48 years old, and she entered the industry different, not the same reasons as Jacqueline, but instead it was kind of for student loans, and she wanted more financial stability, which a lot of people do when entering prostitution. And one aspect that Ruse discussed was that prostitution enabled her to further understand her sexuality through like a new level of sexual freedom that came with the profession. And for example, a quote from hers that stood out to me was, prostitution is like any other business in many ways. Um, because, yes, she did, likely as most prostitutes do, meet irrational, rude, and boring people. But she also met a lot of supportive and interesting people who helped broaden like her horizons, as people do in any other federally mandated industry. And she also garnered financial stability by being able to pay off her loans, which was also really interesting. Um, and for my stance, I have two stances. My first stance, is kind of centered more around the morality aspects of prostitution. For example, I believe that government authorities shouldn't be able to really restrict individuals' sexual freedom, and rather all people should be enabled more a freedom of choice when it comes to this issue. And also, I believe that the industry and its workers shouldn't be stigmatized or defined off of like generalizations and socially conforming stereotypes that we typically create in society. And then, still going off this point, I also believe that women are already really over sexualized today and face like a constant threat of sexual assault. And I think that prostitution is one of the few outlets that women have that enables them to at least profit off of these stereotypes and harsh realities by allowing them to regulate and control their own bodies, and as like a business kind of. And then my other stance is, oh yeah, as the photo you can see, it talks about how sex work is work and it is a job like many other things. Um, Another stance of mine is legality, like surrounding prostitution. And for this, I really believe that our current criminalization process of the industry ignores the real perpetrators, who are the pimps, while instead holding prostitutes liable. And many prostitutes are like coerced into the industry. And even the Catholic Church talks about how they believe that the prostitutes themselves are victims. Um, Whereas instead, the pimps typically are not, and are typically abusive. And then also, I think that legalizing prostitution can garner women more control because it'll lessen the value of the pimp's role and promote a healthier industry by enabling the government to create new regulations surrounding the industry by having like a stronger control on it if it's legalized, like other federally mandated jobs. And also, I think it will become safer if we do this because without the fear of being like reprimanded or criminalized, I think that more prostitutes, when they're put in like dangerous situations, will be able to like speak out about it and like contact police authorities. And for instance, if you look at the infographic, you can see how it discusses that legalization actually creates a safer environment in many ways. For example, in the bottom right corner, it says in certain studies it was found that sex crimes dropped when indoor prostitution was decriminalized, and when stricter laws were implemented, violent crimes against sex workers were actually increased. And then for my next slide, one rational objection for prostitution is the Catholic Church. And the Catholic Church really believes it's also more around the morality of it. And one reason that the Catholic Church takes such a prominent stand against prostitution is not only because it's addressed in the Catechism, which is really the core root of all Catholic teaching, but also because it goes against one of the most fundamental values or beliefs, which is respecting people's human dignity. And the fact that prostitution, or more generally sex trafficking, is addressed in the Catechism is really monumental because it showcases how like deeply rooted the issue is, and it also offers an extremely valid Catholic teaching opinion for like other people to follow. And then a similar notion is also discussed. This prostitution is also discussed in the Second Vatican Council and in the International Meeting of Pastoral Care for the Liberation of Women of the Street. And the church says that not only is prostitution somewhat a form of modern day slavery, but it's also an act of violence against women, and therefore it violates basic human rights, which they also really value like protecting. And however, though, despite this, the Catholic Church also believes that the women, as I previously said, are victims, and they look upon them with compassion, as according to Archbishop Marchetto, who he says the church looks upon them with a sense of compassion and Christian welcome. And so back to my point, they really do, both sides also kind of address the necessity of like eliminating the role of the pimp because of how abusive that is. And then my rebuttal to this is that though the Catholic Church makes a very strong point, and they can obviously construct their own set of moral beliefs and values considering they're their own religion, I don't really believe that moral objections should justify criminalization of an industry, and a system that I believe seeks to provide for humanity, however unconventionally this may be, should at least be supported with the same respect and treatment as other socially normalized jobs. And I believe that in all aspects of life, we should also just learn to be more accepting and understanding of other people and what they choose to do with their lives, especially when these choices aren't directly like impacting us or threatening us in any way. And additionally, we shouldn't seek to go out of our way to like regulate and restrict others when it comes to such personal situations, such as like people's bodies and what they choose to do with it. And then another objection is safety issues for prostitution, and this is another controversial aspect of legalizing prostitution because many people believe that if we were to legalize prostitution, the women and people within the industry would become more prone to vulnerability, and without the fear from all sides of like pimps, prostitutes, and clients of being held criminally liable when it's criminalized, or reprimanded by the government or police authorities, it would not be as safe and it would be more promoted. And then additionally, another study found that 80% of prostituted girls and women are assaulted by their pimps, and over 1/3 receive death threats against them or their families, and understandably, many therefore refuse to accept and promote such an abusive and unhealthy industry because of all the violence in it. And as you can see in the graph to the right, it's showing that the yellow line is showing how more men are actually soliciting prostitutes, and then the blue line is kind of showing how they're not being punished or held criminally liable despite this. And so that kind of goes into my next point, which is my rebuttal. And in terms of those concerned with the safety aspects of prostitution, I think that by removing the necessity of the pimps through legalization of the industry, not only could women evade additional abuse from their pimps, but they could also gain more regulation over their bodies, and the entire industry could become safer because without the fear of being held criminally liable, more women would be likely to seek help from like police authorities when placed in dangerous situations. And also in terms of like specific evidence, or statistical, the Chicago Police Review did an article where they said that when indoor prostitution was legal, the rate of reported rape offenses fell below historical rates in Rhode Island and the average rates in the US, and that this is likely because with legalization, women held more bargaining power because they could report abusive instances to police authorities without facing charges themselves. And then for my questions for the future, I kind of talk about how it's important to realize that even if we do legalize the sex working industry, we can't really ever know if it will be able to be normalized to the same extent as other federally mandated jobs, or if we can integrate it into society as like a common and acceptable profession. And some questions I have are that if we ultimately do legalize the industry, can prostitutes receive the same benefits as workers within other fields, such as like healthcare, or like be required to pay taxes, which is a benefit. And additionally, can the government now issue more regulations, such as like mandatory HIV testing or background checks that could like promote a healthier and safer industry? And also with these protocols surrounding the industries, not only can the system become more efficient and effective, but it can also become much safer, especially if we seek to like integrate possibly like technology into background checks so that we can monitor like people's records and like their background in general. And then this is my works cited page.